People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. As Sri Lanka gears for a 14th November parliamentary election following last week's election of a brand new president, the stakes are high. Between managing political, socio-economic, geopolitical interests, how must the president and his new cabinet act? Above all, how must the aspirations of the people of Sri Lanka take centre stage? To discuss the challenges that lie ahead, I'm pleased to welcome back to the studio political economist and senior lecturer at the University of Jaffna, Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar. Good evening and welcome to the show.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Kadirgamar, there is mounting pressure on the new president to stay on course with the IMF, pursuant to the IMF Supported Program. The president will need parliamentary strength in order to forge a national consensus which will determine his bargaining power with the IMF. Could you take us through the current status quo?
Yeah, so as you know, Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt 2 years ago for the first time in its history. And since then, we've gone into an IMF program. And while this is the 17th IMF program, this time is different because we defaulted. And IMF plays the role of arbiter for debt restructuring. In other words, the IMF sets the framework or the parameters on the basis of which we can get debt relief from the creditors. This can be bilateral creditors like India, China, and Japan. And more importantly, the bulk of our debt are to what are called bondholders, these huge hedge funds, mutual funds, what we have borrowed in the international capital markets. So the IMF is setting the terms for that. Now, there's a lot of question about how the IMF has constructed that debt restructuring process. If we look at the details, so we will get some leeway for the next 3 years while the IMF program is lasting. Until 2027, we won't have to repay debt to the what are called official creditors, that is the other governments, and to the bondholders. We continue to pay our debt back to the multilateral agencies like the World Bank, ADB, and the IMF. But after 2027, that is what we are looking at. How much would we be paying back every year? Right now, according to the IMF's debt sustainability analysis, after 2027, each year we would be paying the equivalent of 4.5% of our GDP in external debt, right? That's a lot of money. That is about 30% of our total revenues. In other words, we've been raising the VAT, we've been raising income taxes, but 30% of that is going to go towards repaying these creditors. Or we say we want to have an export-led economy. According to the IMF data, after 2027, about 30% of our export earnings, the dollars that we bring in, is going to go towards repaying this debt. So we really need to rethink this, because there's a lot of concern that after 2027, when we have to start repaying all this debt, the next shock would then again push us into default. So all this suffering that our people have gone through, the austerity measures, the lack of employment, the low income, all of that suffering we might have to go through again once this program is over.
There are about 70 developing countries around the world in debt distress, and strict austerity measures affect the most marginalized the worst. At what point do you think Sri Lanka must, whilst honoring its IMF commitments and not upsetting the apple cart, seek alternative avenues of development finance?
Absolutely. So, you know, even the UN Secretary General has come out and said the international financial system is broken, because not just Sri Lanka, almost half the developing countries in the world are in debt trouble now. So, and you know, about almost a dozen of them have defaulted like us. Many others are on the verge of default. And so what are they doing? They are cutting all their spending, social spending, that is necessary. That's why we see in Sri Lanka, for example, the doubling of poverty. school dropouts, malnutrition, livelihoods are in disarray. So we need a different way of development with different sources of finance, because what's happened with this kind of finance is that we pay huge amounts in interest payments. This is not the case in the Western world. You know, when the interest rates in the Western world were close to 0%, we borrowed in these international capital markets anywhere between 6 and 9%. And these are in dollars. Our GDP is not even growing that high to be able to repay this level of interest. So then we have to really rethink our model of development. We should be using more of our own funds, which means there has to be redistribution. The wealthy in this country have gotten away without contributing to the economy. Perhaps there's a need for something like a wealth tax so that we use that towards development. We have to look at other avenues for concessionary financing. We need to negotiate with other countries that are willing to support us through this process. We need better engagement with the development banks. We would also need our own development bank to be able to do this kind of development that is sustainable. It absolutely makes no sense if every few years we are going to be in crisis. We start something, then it stops. We have to try to again find stability.
Dr. Kadirgamar, do you believe that there are massive gaps in how Sri Lanka is reimagined in terms of having a comprehensive economic plan and vision?
Absolutely, Sonali. Now, you know, many countries like ours, we went through centuries of colonialism. And when we gained independence, there was a vision that, okay, now we need development. We need to find other avenues of developing our country, not just in the way in which the country had been working for the colonial powers, which meant we needed a proper plan. So planning was a big question in many of these post-colonial governments. Now, that has been left out in the last 4 decades. When Sri Lanka went through liberalization, or what is called structural adjustment, under the guidance of the IMF and the World Bank, they said now the market will solve everything. So we don't even do any planning. We don't have a proper industrial policy for that matter. And you can't develop an economy without a plan. So what are we doing? Some donor brings us a project. Might be China, it might be India. We just run after it. Does it really fit our needs? Will it really support our development? We don't know. And it's that kind of development projects, investment in highways or trophy projects like the Lotus Tower, this is what has also pushed us into this debt trap. But even more importantly, how are we going to develop our country for our next generation if we don't have a plan? And that plan has to be through consultation with the people.
So where is this master plan supposed to be situated? Is it in a book? Is it on paper? Is it online? How do we reimagine this?
You know, soon after independence, our Ministry of Finance was called Ministry of Finance and Planning. It's an ongoing process, but at the same time there has to be a clear vision. For example, let's take up problems now. You know, we are an island nation, we have a lot of resources. Why is there a food crisis in this country? Food is the most basic thing. We need planning for that. We are an island nation. I'm doing some research on fisheries these days, and if you look at seafood consumption in 2015, per capita or per person, we were consuming something like 31.5 kilograms of seafood or fish per year. By 2023, that has come down to 19 kilograms. That's almost a 40% drop. And 60 to 70% of our people's animal protein comes from seafood. We are an island nation. What happened? Lack of planning. We never gave seafood production enough importance. Of course, we need exports, but we also have to think about self-sufficiency. That is part of planning. But this is true of everything else. Do we need such a huge fuel bill? We saw the fuel queues. Why did we not invest, for example, in public transport? That's long-term planning, right? Having a good public transport system. So all of this has to be considered.
And don't you think that given Sri Lanka's situation, it is those who are engaged in farming, fishing, forestry who should be the wealthiest among us, not the rest?
Absolutely. I mean, they are the ones who are feeding us.
Absolutely.
And but we have not invested in agriculture at all over the last 4 decades, or in fisheries, right? We gave a few subsidies, maybe for the fertilizer or fuel, but it's not everything about high tech. But even there has to be investment. There's constant technological changes, and we have to move forward. I work a lot with, again, small scale fishers. What we are actually seeing with this economic crisis is that people are going back to catamarans, right? Instead of even using the small outboard motor boats or using sails.
So that's regressive.
That's regressive. We are going back. What we need to do is, our youth can come into agriculture and fisheries. There's so many ways in using appropriate technology, but all that requires investment. That requires planning on the part of the government. And we've really abandoned, I would say, our rural communities. And I think this election and the results is, in a way, a wake-up call from them. And if we don't do that, we can dream all we want that we want to build a Singapore. We know that's not going to happen. And now we've even lost our most very basic things, such as food.
In terms of addressing this multidimensional crisis that is before us, what must the focus and priority be of the government in bringing forth policies that really address the needs of the people?
Yeah, so, we're in the middle of the worst economic crisis since, I would say, the 1930s. But there are also other problems now. Climate change has become a huge issue. If you look at the world, it's not the same anymore. Look at all the wars that are happening in Ukraine, in the Middle East. There's tension in the South China Sea. We have to be cognizant of the so many different shocks that can hit Sri Lanka. So we need to prepare for all of that. So how do we build a sustainable economy? In a way, it's also back to basics, giving importance to the food system. How do we change our built environment to the extent possible that it becomes more self-sufficient? We use less in terms of imports because those are susceptible to shocks. People give very simple answers. They say they will increase tourism, but we know that tourism is a very fickle industry. If there is a war in the region, then suddenly there will be no tourists. Or what happened with the pandemic. So we really need to rethink how we approach our economy and society. And I think at the heart of it should be much more investment in our youth, our next generation. Sri Lanka's strength all along was free education, free healthcare, and we even had a food subsidy until the 1970s. If we had that food subsidy, now people won't be starving. So we need to, I think, go back to that. We need to make that a priority, because the way things are going, the youth are only thinking of leaving the country. And if the next generation is not committed to staying here and rebuilding the country, that will be a huge setback in the future.
How do we go about incentivizing youth, encouraging youth who have been let down? How do we harness their potential? How do we involve them in the country's development? How do we ensure that their development is also a priority?
Of course, education is important, vocational training, all of that to develop their skills. But I think, 2 years ago, the youth spoke out, right? When the huge protests, the Aragalia happened, it was the youth who were in the forefront. I think they realized that this is not the direction of the country that they wanted. That is what woke up the country. So also having youth participate in our governance, in our politics, and that is what really participatory development means. Development is not something that is isolated from politics. It's not a technical or technocratic subject. It requires people's participation, and I think the youth have to be brought front and center into that. So how can we think of our state, our society, our economy, where the youth can have much greater participation? So even the investments that we make in the country, the kind of production, because that is where we are going to be able to grow, it has to think about how can we absorb so much of our unemployed youth. And during an economic crisis, the private sector on its own is not going to move forward because they're only going to think about profits. That's the logic of the private sector. So during a time like this, the state has to play a bigger role to make sure that there are different options for our youth in terms of employment, and it will be a range of things. It will also be in the rural economy. We have to figure out what urban possibilities there are to really tap into. Each individual is different, and as a university teacher, I see that every day. And how can we, but all of them have their own strengths. How can we work towards that? But for all of that, the right kind of infrastructure, the right kind of investments have to be made by the state. And that again is a question of planning. The right kind of industrial policy to find the kind of niche industries that we can promote. Industries are not just about manufacturing. Agricultural industries are important. That is one of our big resources. Now I'm from Jaffna in the north. Our big resource is the palmyra. You can do so many things with the palmyra tree, the fruit, the sap, the root, the tree itself, but we have not tapped it.
Dr. Kadirgamar, when we speak of the people's mandate received by the new president, Anurukumara Dissanayaka, in terms of the challenge that lies ahead, the president has to walk a tightrope in balancing competing interests. Ultimately, it is Sri Lanka that collectively has to emerge victorious. How important is it to collectively support this journey towards Sri Lanka's economic recovery?
Yeah, now during any election, everybody is divided, there are a lot of debates, but I think the people have spoken. They were waiting a long time for these elections, and they have elected President Anurukumara Dissanayaka, and I think he should be given the space and the support towards rebuilding the country. It's really an unenviable moment, because regardless of who comes to power amidst this kind of crisis, it's going to be a very tall order in terms of addressing all these challenges. What I'm concerned about is that already there's mounting pressure from different quarters. I think the elite in this country are very unhappy because for the first time it's a party from outside the mainstream. In other words, up to now it was two political parties or their offshoots that have ruled Sri Lanka. A new actor has come to the helm of state power. They are uncomfortable. The international actors, the powerful countries, the West, the United States, they also have a lot of misgivings. And if those pressures mount, it will be very hard for this president to do his task. So I think that space should be given, that support should be given, and they should be given a chance to be able to try to rebuild the economy, because that is the main issue. And now, if that kind of support can be given, if other countries can also provide, as I mentioned earlier, concessionary development finance, realizing the hard time that Sri Lanka is going through, it is that kind of support that would ultimately make sure that Sri Lanka becomes again a credible, a vibrant partner in this global order. Because what we are seeing is both domestically the huge suffering, the unraveling that we have seen, but even internationally mounting tensions. And it doesn't help anybody when they come after Sri Lanka in this kind of a difficult time. And so it's to be seen. Now we are heading towards parliamentary elections. Again, there will be a lot of debates, but I'm hoping that through those debates we come to a consensus that these are our priorities, that we should all work together. And in that process, the international actors, the United Nations, the various development agencies should also think long-term and support Sri Lanka.
I'd also like your perspectives on the importance of navigating Sri Lanka's relationship with major global powers, from the Indias to the Chinas to the Western powers. How must this be done in a manner in which diplomatic interests are ensured whilst ultimately facilitating national interests?
Yeah, I mean, Sri Lanka has now become the center of a lot of geopolitical tension, and we need to figure out a way, and we can learn from our past. In the 1960s and 70s, Sri Lanka played an important role in the non-aligned movement. And again, I think our foreign policy should be non-aligned. We can't gain anything. In fact, we will be the ultimate loser if we think we can play India against China or China against the West. It just doesn't work for a small country like us. At the same time, the contradiction between these major powers is so deep that they may not immediately listen to us. And this is where, when I say a non-aligned policy, it's obviously not the same time as it was in the 1970s when there was a strong non-aligned movement. But nevertheless, we should make alliances with smaller countries like ours. It's not just about the big powers. There are so many other smaller countries in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, who are in a similar situation like us, even when it comes to negotiating our debt and its future, debt relief, for example. Only if we link up with other countries like ours that we would have a stronger voice.
The importance of fostering inclusive dialogue between diverse stakeholders, such as the business community, which is a huge stakeholder in Sri Lanka's economy, civil society, academia consisting of fantastic academics, technocrats, other experts, people at the grassroots level like the farmers, the fishers. How important is it to have these discourses, issue-based ones, in order to comprehensively arrive at a larger sort of plan, framework for the country?
Absolutely. I think maybe not immediately, but after the parliamentary elections, whichever government that is formed, I would say, and other countries have done this, they should really have a national conference, right? A national conference where all these actors come together and we take stock. Okay, what has happened to our economy? Where are we really now at this moment? Because all of us have to come to we can't be saying that some people are saying that everything is fine, others are saying everything is so horrible, we have to come to a consensus on where the country stands and where we want to go to. And that should create, hopefully, people's participation in development and the economy, and also a people-centered vision of where we want to go to.
Dr. Kadirgamar, bridging the north-south divide is a crucial question that is before this country. For decades, through successive governments, a common chant of the people of the north and east has been that governments have reneged on their promises. Therefore, we see this trust deficit between the people and the government. How must this be bridged now that we are going in for parliamentary elections, now that we have a new president? How important is it to prioritize this, and what's the best way to do it? Because successive governments have made attempts at it. As to whether those attempts were genuine, we don't know. But now that we have a new opportunity before us, how must this be done?
Yeah, first of all, I think we need a change in our political culture. We really need to make sure that the minorities in this country are brought in to the political process. Our politics has been very elite-driven. I would say even the masses in the rural south have been neglected by our political culture. So we need to change that. But there are also structural problems. Now, right at independence, what did we do? We denied the citizenship of the hill country Tamils, the people who really have built the wealth of this country. How can we give them confidence? Their biggest ask now is land. You know, everybody would like to have that small piece of land to be able to build a house. So those kinds of concerns. But to be able to address all of that, our state structure has to change. And that has been the long ask, that there has to be power sharing at the center. Our state is very much centralized. There has to be power sharing at the center, where all the minorities can also have a chair at that table to be able to negotiate. There should be devolution of power, because if we are really to develop our rural economy, agriculture, fisheries, and so on, there should be devolution of power, because only when power is close to the people, that power will be used properly, state power will be properly used towards development. So these are the long concerns. I think it's encouraging that the President in his manifesto said that they will consider a new constitution for the country, that they would consider abolishing the executive presidency, which has been the bane of the problem of political culture, too much power in one individual. So all of that has to change, and so creating that consensus towards a new constitution and bringing the minorities in with the idea of power sharing and devolution are crucial.
Ultimately, the people of Sri Lanka want tangible results. How do we facilitate that?
I think we are going to have to work through one issue by issue. There are some issues that are a crucial priority now. Food, I would say, is one. And also we have to think in terms of what resources are available immediately. So I would say, okay, the state maybe doesn't have enough finances, but the Sri Lankan state owns a lot of land. So land distribution and land redistribution could be things that the state could do, because what I've found even in my own research is that if people have a couple acres of land, they won't starve. They will be able to produce something. So we have to prioritize what we can do, even as we work towards a longer term vision of developing our country. I think Sri Lanka's biggest strength, as we saw last week, is our democratic culture. People do have a sense of democracy. We have never allowed a military coup in this country. We have from time to time changed governments, and this new president and the government that he's trying to make should be given the space to attempt this change.
Anti-corruption is the slogan, one of the slogans upon which this government, this president was propelled into power. Equally also, it is one of the key prerequisites of the IMF Supported Agreement. We have the necessary legislature in place, with the most recent Anti-Corruption Act being implemented. Practically, do you think what more needs to be done to create that cultural shift in attitude of the people? Because bribery and corruption, these are deeply entrenched in the Sri Lankan culture.
I think that for me is also a political question. You know, if there was much greater participation of people in governance, that itself would be a big check. When we start to centralize power, too much power in the line ministries, too much power in the executive president, that then allows for more leakage and possibility of corruption. So changing our political culture should involve empowering the people to ask questions, empowering the people to be part of development and the use of state resources. So we have to take that, we have to take people seriously, and for too long I think our politicians, our state structure has not given people the importance that they should have, and that's what really is a people-centered politics that Sri Lanka needs to move towards.
Dr. Kadirgamar, my final question to you, how important is it for us to be hopeful about Sri Lanka's future?
These are very difficult times. The people have been going through much suffering, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because if you look at our past history, during these types of very difficult times, if you take the 1930s when Sri Lanka went through the Great Depression along with the rest of the world, there was the malaria crisis, just like the pandemic now, when 2% of our people died. And then what did we do? We elected our state councils, we brought up the idea of free education and then free healthcare. So time and time again, we've also found our solutions. So on the one hand, people might be lamenting, saying that, look, all our political parties are falling apart. But I think that is part of the democratic process. Whether in the south or the north, we are seeing a lot of political change. And it is during these moments that the next generation, the youth, also come into political life. And I'm hopeful that after the parliamentary elections, that we will slowly start the process of rebuilding. And that would have to start from the periphery, from the regions, with the youth. I don't see that happening just in Colombo. I see that coming from all other parts of Sri Lanka.
All right. And on that hopeful note, we wrap up this edition of the People's Platform. Have a safe weekend. Good night.